Some decisions announce themselves. They give a man time to think, time to weigh the consequences, time to talk himself in or out of whatever it is he is about to do. And then there are the other kind, the ones that make themselves fast and wordless before a man even knows he has made them. Holt Briggs would spend a long time afterward wondering which kind his had been. He was mending the east fence that afternoon when he saw her. The sun was 2 hours past its peak, the kind of heat that turns the air itself into something solid and pressing. And he had been working steadily since morning without much on his mind beyond the broken post and the handful of staples in his shirt pocket. His land was 22 miles of grass and scattered rock and a creek that ran dependable from April through August. Nothing spectacular by frontier standards, but every foot of it, earned through 8 years of quiet and stubborn work. He did not have neighbors close enough to trouble him. He had chosen that deliberately. The movement caught the corner of his eye first. Something low and fast through the dry grass on the far side of the slope, maybe 400 yards out. He straightened, shading his eyes with his forearm. For a moment he thought it was a deer, the way the figure moved, that same lunging, desperate quality of something running, not toward anything but away. Then it rose, and he saw it was a person, a young woman, running hard across the open ground, her dark hair loose and flying behind her. He watched her for a second, maybe two. Long enough to see that she was not slowing down, not looking where she was going, not making any decision about direction at all. Just running, the way people run when every second of distance between them and what is behind them is the only thing that matters. Then he looked past her. On the ridge to the north, 5 riders had appeared. They were not moving at a run. They were moving at the deliberate pace of men who know they are going to catch what they are chasing and are in no hurry about it. Spread out in a loose line, unhurried, rifles across their saddles. That unhurried quality was what made Holt's stomach drop. Panic is one thing. Patience in pursuit is something else entirely. He did not think about it after that point. He put down his fencing pliers, stepped through the wire gap, and walked toward the girl at a pace fast enough to cover ground, but slow enough that she would see him coming before he reached her. He raised one hand, not waving, just showing it. Showing it was empty. She saw him when she was maybe 60 yards out. He watched her almost stop, almost break left or right, the way a frightened animal calculates escape. He kept walking toward her at the same pace, hand still up, and after a moment she kept coming because he was in front of her and the riders were behind, and one of those options was better than the other, even if it was not certain. She reached him breathing so hard she could barely stand. Up close, she was younger than he had first thought. Early 20s, no more, wearing a deerskin dress with beadwork along the collar that had come loose on one side. Her feet were in moccasins that had gone to pieces. She had been running a long time before she reached his land. He did not ask questions. He looked at her for 1 second, glanced back at the ridge where the 5 riders were still descending at their patient, terrible pace and said, "Come with me." She understood enough English, or understood his tone, or understood simply the plain physics of the situation. She came with him. The barn was closer than the house. He put her in the back corner, behind the hay, and told her to stay down and not move. She looked at him once. A look he could not fully read, not trust exactly. Not yet, but something like the preliminary decision that might eventually become trust. And she lowered herself into the shadows between the stacked bales. He pulled the bay mare into the stall nearest the door and went to work on her left rear hoof with a pick, his back to the riders, by the time they came through his gate. There were 5 of them. He had counted right. 4 were men he did not recognize, dressed in the working clothes of ranch hands, but carrying themselves like something other than cow hands. There was a loose, watchful readiness about them that he associated with men hired for their willingness rather than their skill. The 5th man he did know, at least by reputation. Whitmore Cole. He ran the largest cattle operation in the territory, 40,000 acres pushing steadily in every direction, and his name came up in conversation the way a bad smell comes up in a closed room. You noticed it and moved away from it and did not always say what you were thinking. Cole pulled up just inside the gate and looked around the yard with the expression of a man who owns things and is in the habit of looking at things he is about to own. He was somewhere in his late 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had the particular smooth quality of a man who had spent years making certain that other people did his worrying for him. "Briggs," he said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a fence post. "Cole," Holt said. He kept working the pick along the mare's frog, not looking up. "What brings you out this way?" "Lost something," Cole said. "Thought it might have come through here." Holt set the hoof down and straightened, wiping his hands on his thighs. He looked at Cole. "What kind of something?" "Apache girl." Cole tilted his head slightly. "Young, running. My men had been tracking her since this morning." Holt looked at the five of them, then back at Cole. "What did she take?" The question caught Cole for just a fraction of a second. "Property," he said finally. "What property?" "That's not really your concern." Holt nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is deciding how much truth to put into his next sentence. "Haven't seen any Apache on my land today," he said. "Not running or otherwise." Cole looked at him. Cole looked at the barn. He was not a stupid man. That was the thing about him. That was what made him genuinely dangerous rather than just powerful. He was the kind of man who had gotten where he was by watching people carefully and understanding what they were not saying. "Mind if my men take a look around?" he said. Holt felt the specific cold weight of a moment he had known was coming, but had hoped might not arrive quite this soon. He put his hands in his back pockets, took a breath, and looked Cole in the eye. "I mind," he said. The silence that followed had a shape to it. One of Cole's men shifted in his saddle. Another moved his horse a step to the left, not for any reason, just the way men position themselves when they want to be facing the right direction if something starts. Cole looked at him for a long time. "You're protecting her," he said. It was not a question. "I'm telling you there's nobody on my land that you have a claim to," Holt said. "And I'm telling you that you're welcome to water your horses at the trough and then go on your way." Another silence. Cole turned his horse slowly, looking around the property the way he had done when he rode in, assessing, calculating, storing away. Then he looked back at Holt with an expression that was almost pleasant. "All right," he said. "We'll take the water. Appreciate it." They watered the horses and they rode out, and Holt went back to the mare's hoof and listened to the sound of hoofbeats fading south. He waited 10 minutes after the last echo died before he went to the barn door and spoke into the shadows. "They're gone. If you're finding this story worth your time, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps keep these stories coming." She told him her name was Ayanna. She said it quietly, sitting in the yard an hour after dark with a tin of water that she drank in small, careful sips, the way someone drinks when they know from experience that drinking too fast after a long run makes you sick. The night had cooled, and the stars were out, bright and dense the way they only get far from town, and Holt sat on the opposite side of the fire he had built, small, low, just enough light to see by, and let her take her time. He had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do with a person who had been running was make them feel like they had to explain themselves before they had recovered enough to speak. He had offered food. She had eaten. He had offered the water. She was drinking it. The explanation, if it came, would come when she was ready. It came. She had been at the creek. That was how she started, not with context or history, but with the specific moment, the way people begin when the thing they need to tell is still too large to frame from the outside. She had been at the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Cole's territory, a creek that her people had used for generations, part of a route they traveled seasonally. A route so old it had worn itself into the land the way water wears stone. She had gone to fill water skins before the rest of the group moved on. 2 of Cole's men had been there. She described them briefly, one large, one with a cut scar below his left eye. They had not seen her, she said. She had been in the brush on the bank, but she had seen them. She stopped there for a moment. Holt waited. They had been talking to an Apache elder named Chayton. He was old, she said, older than anyone in the group, a man who had been traveling this route since before his hair turned white. He had something in his hand. Documents, she thought. She had heard him say the word papers in English, and she knew enough English to understand that word. Cole's men had wanted the papers. Chayton had refused to give them. And then the larger of the 2 men had done something that Ayanna described in 4 flat, factual words, as if saying it plainly was the only way she could keep her voice from breaking. He killed him. Right there, on the bank of the creek that Chayton's people had used for generations, in the heat of a midday that should have been nothing at all. And when it was done, the man with the scar had gone through the elders' belongings and taken the papers, and the 2 of them had ridden back toward Cole's land. What they had not found was the small leather pouch that Chayton had pressed into the mud beneath the roots of the cottonwood before the confrontation started. As if he had known. As if some part of him had understood what was coming and had tried to protect what was inside, even though he could not protect himself. Ayanna had waited until they were gone. She had crossed the bank and found the pouch. She had opened it and looked at what was inside. Maps, she said, and a land deed, with names on it she did not fully understand but understood enough to recognize as something significant, something that explained what Chayton had been protecting. And she had taken it and run, because when the riders came back an hour later and found Chayton there and found her footprints in the mud, she had already known that stopping was not an option. Holt sat with all of this for a long time. The fire crackled. An owl called from somewhere out past the fence. He thought about Chayton's hands pressing that pouch into the mud. He thought about what a man has to believe about the future to make a gesture like that, to protect evidence when he knows he is not going to be there to tell anyone about it. He thought that was one of the braver things he had ever heard of, and he thought it quietly without saying it out loud, because some things belong to the person who did them. "Where is it now?" he said. "The pouch." She put her hand to her dress, just below the collar, where the beadwork had come loose on one side. She had stitched it into the lining. Holt nodded. "All right," he said. He stood up. "We need to think carefully. Subscribe to the channel. There are more frontier stories coming, and you won't want to miss where this one leads." The problem with thinking carefully was that it required options, and options required understanding exactly what Whitmore Cole was willing to do. Holt had a working theory about that by now, and it was not a comforting one. A man who would kill an Apache elder on the bank of a creek in broad daylight was a man who had done the arithmetic and decided that certain things were worth the cost. That kind of man did not leave loose ends lying around. Ayanna was a loose end. The pouch was a loose end. And now, whether he had chosen it or not, so was Holt Briggs. He had one thing working in his favor. Cole had not searched the barn. He had looked at it. Holt had felt that look like a hand on the back of his neck. But something had held him from pushing it further. Maybe it was the calculation that a fight today was premature, that the girl could be found another time, that there was no need to complicate things with a rancher he did not yet own. That kind of restraint, in Holt's experience, was temporary. It lasted exactly as long as the situation allowed. He went inside and looked at the map he kept tacked to the wall by the stove. A rough one, hand-drawn, that covered the territory within 2 days' ride in any direction. The nearest town with a law office was Sulphur Creek, 16 miles south. Sheriff there was a man named August Ferris, who Holt knew only slightly, but had never had reason to distrust. The problem with Ferris was simple. Cole had considerable influence in Sulphur Creek. The general store owed him. The bank carried his loans. 3 of the town's largest landowners had done deals with him in the past 2 years, deals that tended to work out better for Cole than for the other party. Walking into Ferris's office with a land deed and a dead Apache elder and a story about Whitmore Cole was going to require that Ferris be either very honest or very brave. And Holt did not yet know which he was. He went back outside. Ayanna was sitting in the same spot, but she was no longer looking at the fire. She was looking at the dark rim of the northern ridge, and her expression had shifted into something watchful and focused, the same quality of attention he imagined had kept her alive through a full day of being hunted. "There is a second man," she said without looking at him. "What second man?" "In your territory, north. He has been there since the sun started down." She paused. "He is alone." Holt looked at the ridge. He could not see anything, and that itself told him something. She had seen it, and he had not, which meant she was accustomed to reading darkness for things that did not want to be seen. One of Cole's. No. She was quiet for a moment. He sits like someone who is afraid of being seen by Cole's men. That was a different thing entirely. Holt took his rifle from the porch post and walked north. The man on the ridge was young, mid-20s, maybe younger, and Apache, and he had his hands out by the time Holt crested the slope, which was either smart or a very good performance of being smart. His name, communicated in a mixture of Apache and careful English that they worked through slowly, was something that translated roughly as running smoke, though he said Holt could call him by the short form, which sounded like Soka. He had been following Ayanna's trail since midday, he said. Not to find her for Cole. He was her cousin. The 3 of them sat on the ridge in the dark for an hour. Soka explained what Holt could not have known from Ayanna's account alone, the full shape of what Chayton had been carrying. The papers in the pouch were not just any documents. They were a deed and a surveyor's agreement signed 2 years earlier, recognizing a stretch of creek land as belonging jointly to the Territory Apache Band under a negotiated agreement with the previous territorial governor. An agreement that Cole had known about. An agreement that stood directly in the way of Cole's latest expansion, the one he had been working toward for 3 years, the one that required him to own the Eastern Creek rights in order to consolidate everything into the largest single cattle operation in the territory's history. Chayton had known. That was why he had been there. He had gone to the creek that day to make sure the deed was preserved, to keep it in his possession because he had heard rumors, through the network of information that existed among the bands, the kind of network that white men rarely understood the sophistication of, that Cole was looking for it. And Cole had found him first. Holt sat with that for a while. The stars had moved an inch across the dark. The fire below in the yard had burned down to coals. "Is there anyone else who knows what's in those papers?" he said. Soka nodded. "My grandmother," he said. "She was present at the original signing." "Where is she?" 3 hours north. She will not come here." "She doesn't have to." Holt looked at the ridge, then at Ayanna, then back at the dark land to the south. "I need to go to Sulphur Creek tomorrow morning. I need to know if Ferris is the kind of man who will hear this." Soka and Ayanna exchanged a look that had the compressed speed of 2 people who have known each other long enough to have a whole conversation in a single glance. Then Ayanna said, "Before the sun is up, Cole's men will be watching the south trail." "I know. There is another way." The other way took 2 hours longer and went through a stretch of country that Holt had only crossed twice in 8 years, a narrow corridor through the rock formations east of the main trail, rough going for a horse. The kind of passage that was invisible on any map he had ever seen, and was probably only known to people who had been using it for generations before the territory had a name. Ayanna rode behind him and gave directions in a mixture of words and gestures that he followed without question, partly because he trusted her instincts, and partly because the alternative was the South Trail and the men Cole had sent to watch it. They reached Sulphur Creek before the town was fully awake. Holt left Ayanna at the edge of town. There was no good way to bring her into a law office at first light without creating a problem that would take longer to manage than they had time for, and walked to Farris's door and knocked. August Farris took some time to wake up. He was a heavy-set man, with deep lines around his mouth that suggested either permanent worry or permanent dissatisfaction. And he came to the door in his undershirt, with his boots half on, and looked at Holt with the expression of a man who was trying to remember if he liked him. He apparently decided he did, because he opened the door wider and said, "Come in." Holt came in. He laid the pouch on the desk. He told Farris the story from the beginning, flat and without embellishment, the way you tell a story when you need the other person to understand exactly what happened rather than feel anything particular about it. Farris listened without interrupting, which was something. He poured himself a cup of last night's coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it without appearing to notice. When Holt finished, Farris picked up the pouch and looked at it without opening it. "This is Cole," he said. "Yes." Farris was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Holt had not expected, and that struck him as one of the most honest things a lawman had said to him in 15 years of frontier life. "I've been waiting for 3 years for something I could actually hold in my hands," he said. "Cole's careful. His men do his worst work where there are no witnesses." He looked at Holt. "But there's a witness this time." "2 witnesses," Holt said. "The girl who saw it, and an elder woman who was present at the original signing." Farris set down the cold coffee and reached for his jacket. What followed was not fast. Nothing in frontier law moved fast, and Holt had always thought that was sometimes a mercy. That the slowness gave people time to think rather than act on the first feeling that arrived. Farris sent 2 wires that morning. One to the territorial governor's office, one to a circuit judge he trusted in a town 2 days east. Then he rode out to Cole's land himself, alone, which Holt thought took either courage or something very close to it. Cole received him the way Cole received all inconveniences, with surface smoothness and something colder underneath. He denied everything. He said the girl was a thief who had taken property from one of his men during a routine inspection. He said the dead Apache elder was a regrettable discovery that had nothing to do with him or his operation. He said the papers in the pouch were stolen documents that did not represent legitimate claims. He said all of this with the practiced ease of a man who had been preparing this version of events since the moment his riders came back, without the girl and without the pouch. But the thing about Chayton pressing that pouch into the mud was that it had been done before any of the rest of it, which meant the deed predated Cole's version of things by several years and had a legitimacy that his version could not simply talk away. The territorial governor's office, it turned out, had a record of the original signing. The circuit judge, when he arrived 4 days later, had seen disputes like this before. The kind where a powerful man's version of events was very clean and the dead man's version was impossible to hear. He was the kind of judge who found that asymmetry suspicious rather than reassuring. Cole's 2 men, the large one and the one with the scar, were brought in for questioning, separately. One of them held his version for about 40 minutes before the weight of it became more than he wanted to carry alone. Holt was at his ranch when he heard. It was Farris who came to tell him, riding up the east trail in the late afternoon. He stood at the gate and gave the information briefly, the way lawmen give information. Without theater, without the satisfaction that would have been understandable. The case was going to the circuit court. Cole was facing charges. His land expansion was frozen pending the outcome. It was going to be a long process, with all the friction and delay that frontier law produced when money and influence were involved, but the direction of it was set. "The deed stands," Faris said. "Creek rights stand with it." Holt thanked him. Faris rode back south. Ayanna had been at the ranch for those 4 days, working with a quiet efficiency that had reorganized 2 of his storage areas and repaired a section of barn wall that had been leaking wind for 3 winters without his getting around to fixing it. She did these things without being asked and without drawing attention to them, the way people work when they need to keep their hands occupied while the rest of them waits. Soka had come and gone twice, carrying information north and bringing back small things. A clay jar of something medicinal that Ayanna applied to the blisters on her feet from the long run. A piece of dried meat that she shared with Holt without ceremony. A message from the grandmother that Soka translated with what Holt thought was a slightly compressed expression, as if the translation was leaving something out. He asked what the full message was. Soka considered this for a moment, then said, "She says," the rancher did not hesitate. He paused. "She says that is the thing worth knowing about a person." Holt stood with that for a moment and did not say anything back, because some things are better received in silence. Tell us in the comments, would you have hidden her? Would you have faced those riders at your gate without knowing what would come next? We'd love to hear from you. Ayanna left on the 5th morning. The band was moving north. The route was clear now. The creek would be safe, and there were summer grounds waiting 3 days ahead. She came to the door of the barn where Holt was working and stood for a moment in the doorway the way she had stood in the open grass the first day, waiting for him to notice her. He noticed. She said in English that was steadier than when she had arrived. "Chayton's family will know what you did." Holt thought about the old man pressing a leather pouch into the mud under a cottonwood root, understanding what was coming and protecting what he could protect. He thought about the kind of courage it takes to make a gesture like that, when the return on it is not guaranteed, when the future you are protecting it for might not materialize, when you do it simply because it is the right thing to do with what you have, in the time you have left to do anything. "Chayton is the one who made it possible," Holt said. "I just held the door open." Ayanna looked at him. Those dark, precise eyes, the kind that had spent a lifetime reading country for what it was, rather than what it appeared to be. Then she reached into the collar of her dress, where the beadwork had been restitched over the place the pouch had been hidden, and she unclasped something small. She held it out to him. It was a bead, just one. Deep blue, worked from the collar design. She pressed it into his hand and closed his fingers around it before he could say anything. Then she turned and walked up the slope without looking back, and he stood in the barn doorway and watched her go. And the morning light was the particular gold of early summer on dry grass, and the creek at the edge of his property ran clear and steady in the silence. He stood there for a longer time than was probably sensible for a man with a full day's work ahead of him. Then he walked back inside and put the bead on the shelf beside the door, where the light would catch it in the afternoon, and went to work. His land was 22 miles of grass and scattered rock, and a creek that ran clear from April through August. He had chosen it because it was quiet, and because it was far from the noise of the world, and because he had needed, in those years after everything that had gone wrong, a place where the only things that needed answering were the simple questions of weather and cattle and what needed mending. He had built his life around the idea that smallness was a kind of safety, that a man who did not reach for anything could not lose anything. He had not expected the other thing, the way that smallness, kept long enough, could become a different kind of loss, a slow, invisible one, the kind that does not announce itself but is visible in retrospect, in the long quiet of evenings when there is no one to tell the day to and the fire burns down and the dark comes in through the gaps in the walls. What he had done those 5 days had not been small. He knew that. It had cost him something, and might cost him more before the court case was finished, and he had entered into it without a plan, and without a guarantee, and with nothing except the instinctive understanding that the thing he was looking at was wrong, and that he was standing close enough to do something about it. He did not know whether that made him brave, or simply whether the alternative had been unacceptable to a part of him he had not consulted in years. He thought it might be the same thing. The summer moved on. The circuit court did its slow, procedural work. Cole's men were tried and convicted in early fall, and Cole himself faced a separate proceeding that stretched into the following spring but ended eventually in the way that things end when there is a dead man and a deed, and a grandmother who was present at the original signing and who traveled 2 days to say so in front of a judge with clear, steady eyes. The Creek rights were confirmed. The Apache band traveled the route the following summer without incident, and the summer after that. Holt did not see Ayanna again until the 2nd July, when she came through the east gate on a morning when the light was the same gold it had been the morning she left. She did not knock. She sat at his fence and waited, because she had done this before, and she knew that a man who paid attention would notice. He noticed. He brought coffee. They sat on the porch steps, not inside, with the land laid out in front of them in the early heat, and they talked in the way that 2 people talk when they have not yet said everything and both of them know it. The world was difficult in all the ways the frontier world was always difficult. Not fixed by one court case, not settled by one good season, not made simple by the fact that the right thing had happened once. But the difficulty of a world is different when you are not navigating it alone. It is not lighter exactly, but it is different. That difference, Holt had come to think, was the whole of it. The bead was still on the shelf beside the door. The creek ran clear. The morning held. Some things in a man's life are not about courage in the dramatic sense, not the pistol and canyon wall kind, not the speech at high noon kind. They are about what a man does on an ordinary afternoon in hard heat when a stranger is running across his land and riders are coming over the ridge and there is no time for anything except whatever his truest self decides. In that moment, fast and wordless, a man finds out what he is made of, not who he wanted to be, not who he told himself he was, what he is. Holt Briggs had found out that afternoon, and whatever he was, it was enough. If this story meant something to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories from the frontier coming, stories of choices made in hard moments and the lives that grew from them. And tell us in the comments, have you ever made a decision like Holt's, one that announced itself in a single heartbeat and changed everything that came after? We'd like to know.